So this week we're looking at some of the events which happened between the 18th and the 24th of May. So this week in history we had the execution of Anne Boleyn, but I've done a separate video on Anne Boleyn and the events which happened in this week, and also the aftermath of her execution, what Henry did next, also in there. But it wasn't the only Tudor event actually on that day in history. On the same day, Elizabeth I was released from the Tower of London 18 years later, after being kept there as a prisoner by her half-sister Mary I, who was on the throne at the time. Elizabeth had been caught up in the Wyatt Rebellion. Mary had made unpopular choices when she came to the throne. Also, she was a Catholic, and by this point the Reformation had started to take hold, and people didn't want a Catholic queen on the throne, and they didn't want her to be converting the country back. Obviously some would have welcomed it. We're not that far into the Reformation, but once this Reformation momentum had started to build, then this was going to be a difficult ship to turn back. Mary had, though, gone and married the Catholic Spanish King Philip II. They'd married at Winchester Cathedral. That was not a popular decision on many levels. It reinforced the Catholicism of the reigning monarch, because she was married to a Catholic, but more importantly she was married, and even as queen that meant she had to be subservient to her husband, perhaps a reason why Elizabeth never married. I digress. But also he was a king of another country. Did this mean England was now an annex of Spain? Could that be? And so actually laws were brought in before the marriage to make them sort of almost joint monarchs, so that Mary's power could not be superseded by that of her husband. And things had to be thought through. What would happen if Mary died? Would Philip become King of England? That kind of thing. And that was all sorted out before their marriage, but it was still unpopular. And the Wyatt Rebellion sought to overthrow Mary and put Elizabeth on the throne. So of course Elizabeth was in a very precarious position, even though there was no evidence that she knew anything about the rebellion or was party to their plans. That didn't stop, obviously, her arrest, because she was a figurehead, therefore, for any rebellions. And so Mary had to think, what was she going to do with her half-sister? She had been in the Tower of London since March. And again, I have a video on Elizabeth as prisoner at the Tower of London, which I will put a link in the show notes. She was released from the Tower of London, but not released from arrest. She was taken to downriver, I'm not sure how you do it, to Richmond Palace, and she had a very restless night. She feared that she would be assassinated. What more of a perfect way would it be for Mary if Elizabeth was assassinated by an intruder? The burden of producing evidence against Elizabeth, convicting her and executing her, and all the backlash that would bring would have been, not there. But that wasn't the case, but Elizabeth did fear for that. After her night at Richmond, she was taken to Woodstock in Oxfordshire. Now Woodstock no longer exists, but it's on the grounds of now Blenheim Palace, so it's in that area, and she was kept there until Mary summoned her back to court, when Mary thought she was pregnant and thought she was going to give birth to her heir. But so this week, on the 19th of May, 18 years following the execution of her mother, that Elizabeth was released from the Tower of London. Before I move on, you might be interested to know that where Elizabeth was kept in the Tower of London. She was kept in the royal lodgings. Now, these were the ones that Henry had renovated for her mother Anne Boleyn before Anne's coronation. Anne had stayed there the night before her coronation, and it's also where she was taken to when she was back there as prisoner in May 1536, and that's where Elizabeth was kept as well. So what Elizabeth must have been thinking, whether Elizabeth was thinking, she must have been thinking about her mother, she must have been thinking about what had happened 18 years prior. She was in the same space that her mother had occupied at that time. So she was very fearful. So watch that video if you're interested about Elizabeth's time as prisoner at the Tower, where I cover it in a bit more detail. Also in this week, another event relating to Elizabeth was the fleeing of Mary Queen of Scots from Scotland to Carlisle Castle in the north of England, where effectively Mary came under house arrest and then spent the next almost 2 decades as Elizabeth's prisoner here in England. Back in the episode covering the 8th of May, I covered Mary's execution at Fotheringay Castle, so please do go back and catch up on that if you're interested in the story of Mary Queen of Scots and her execution. Mary had actually fled Scotland looking for safety in England. She was hoping she would meet Elizabeth and that Elizabeth would help her get her throne back. But just Mary's existence in England was a threat to Elizabeth. Elizabeth was our Protestant queen. Mary was a Catholic queen of Scotland. And we're still quite new into the Reformation. And so, the country was split between people who had Catholic sympathies, who wanted to go back to Catholicism, and those who wanted the Reformation to stick. So Mary's presence in England, far away from London, where plots could be hatched and not picked up on for a while, she was a threat. She could be a Catholic figurehead and a threat to Elizabeth's throne. And indeed, during her incarceration, there were plots to overthrow Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. And it is those plots that eventually led to Elizabeth being convinced that Mary needed to be executed. But Mary had fled to England because she was now very unpopular in Scotland. She was seen as a bad queen. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, had been murdered, and Mary had was not seen to pursue his murderers with any real vigour. She married the chief suspect, Bothwell. And Bothwell's death I also covered in a previous episode. So if you want to know more about how Bothwell came to his end, then please go back and watch that. Bothwell had escaped to the continent, but Mary had fled to England. We can only wonder if Mary would have chosen the same course of action had she realised that she was about to begin almost 20 years of incarceration, which would end up with her execution. Last week I covered the legislation that was brought in to begin British summertime in 1916, and it was the 21st of May, which was the first time that our clocks went forward. Spring forward, fall back, that's right, yes, so spring forward. The clocks went forward an hour in order to basically make more use of the daylight hours. Now, I've covered that last week, so I'm just going to share with you this week a couple of news cuttings that I found when I was doing a little trip to Ledbury. Ledbury is a wonderful town if you like Tudor architecture, lots of half-timbered buildings and amazing pubs and lovely places to go. And in one little museum in there, I found on the wall, they've put on the wall some of the news cuttings which were explained to people because this was going to be for the first time we were going to move our clocks. It must have been quite a bizarre thing for people to get their heads around that they were doing. Indeed, people still struggle with it now, over 100 years later, and there's always calls each year for it to be scrapped. Okay, so now let's go a bit further back. 21st of May 1420, and the Treaty of Troyes was signed. Now this treaty is very interesting. The incapacitated King of France, Charles VI, was given into bouts of madness, and his wife Isabeau of Bavaria signed the treaty. Now this treaty was between France and England, and it secured Henry V of England as successor to Charles VI of France. Now this treaty was designed to bring an end to the 100 Years' War and bring peace to both France and England. So Henry wasn't deposing the King of France, he was just taking on the role of heir apparent. And as with all good treaties, it was sealed with a marriage. Henry V was to marry the daughter of Charles VI, Catherine. In the end, Henry V predeceased Charles VI, and so he never became King of France, but his son, Henry VI, did. Now, just as an aside, but I think you'll be interested in this, it's Catherine of Valois who married her servant, Owen Tudor, and it is from that line that we get Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII. In This Week in British History episodes, we talk a lot about the power of monarchs, or the stories around monarchs, and you can see their power in medieval times, Tudor times. Before that, the king or the monarch had power. Now, today in Britain, we have a constitutional monarchy. So the role of the monarch is more on the ceremonial side, most definitely. There are powers, but they generally are still a ceremonial type power. The Queen, for instance, would not call Parliament. She would not ask the Prime Minister to form a government. It is something that has to happen, but it's not something that she would actually change. So how did we get from the point where monarchs had power through to now where we're governed by a Prime Minister and our Parliament? Well, that is a long and incremental story, lots of changes through time. But in this week, there was a significant change. On the 24th of May 1689, the Bill of Rights was passed into law. This was signed into law by joint monarchs William III and Mary II. Mary II was the daughter of James II, the deposed Catholic king who was forced into exile, and William of Orange, William III, who was married to Mary, was invited to come and take the English throne with his wife. That was the Glorious Revolution. They were far less power hungry or interested in absolute power than their predecessors had been. This is also only within a few decades of the English civil wars and the time where Britain was a commonwealth and didn't have a monarch. So William and Mary were quite conscious of this, and this Bill of Rights put into place the power that Parliament had over the monarch. And it was the cornerstone for the constitutional monarchy that we have today. This new law now stated that the monarchy couldn't rule without the consent of Parliament, and it also set forth some freedoms: freedom of speech within Parliament and the freedom of the law to operate without royal interference. Now, many of these changes had been put in or brought in as a direct consequence of the behaviour of James II. So what is really interesting when we look at the journey between absolute monarchy through to constitutional monarchy is many of the changes came about from the fact that our monarchy have this line of succession, which is just when we talk about the right to the throne, we're talking about an accepted format by which we decide who is in line to the throne. Now, that is a whole conversation on its own, because it's about when you're talking about succession for the country, it's good if there's stability, and so knowing who's coming next is a good thing for everybody. But we're also looking here at nepotism and self-preservation, and so when the personalities come into it throughout time, this is where we see changes to how things are set up, basically how governance is set up in this country, but I'm sure we could find parallels in others as well. But this week, a significant step towards the constitutional monarchy that we now have. Thank you for joining me for this episode of This Week in British History. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please do give it a thumbs up, and there should be a button down here somewhere where you can subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate that. feel free to comment below. I will answer to your comments as quickly as I can. If you can't wait for a full week, then please do come and check me out on Facebook or Instagram. The links to both of those channels are in the show notes, as well as suggested further reading and other watching videos that you might want to watch, which I think you find interesting as well if you like the topics that we covered today. But for now, keep safe, keep well, and I will see you all next time. Bye.